going to start with a Mishnah from the Daf a few days ago, and we're going to completely get off track on purpose because I figured this Gemara is very heavy, so I wanted to do a little bit of a lighter topic. So let's see how we get to this lighter topic by first looking at Kufnun Vav, 156. Okay, we're approaching the end, and we spent a lot of weeks on a Shchivmara, right? Wills and estate planning and gifts and the like. And we have we use the term divrei shchivmera k'ksuvin u'kumesurin dami, which basically means that a deathly ill person, the way the Gemara explains is that we didn't want to trouble him or her by making him do a kinyan and getting a sofer and edim and recording it and notarizing and doing all the things. So we made it easy and we said, okay, whatever he says is like it's as though there was a kinyan made. Okay, that's the expression divrei shchivmera kiksuvin. It's as though it's written down, even though it really actually isn't. But we had, Rahmanas on the guy, which is certainly reasonable. However, not everybody agrees with this concept. Okay, I mean, the Gemara assumed for many, many, many pages that this concept is held by all, until we got to page 156, where the Mishnah on the bottom said, "Hamachalak nechasav al piv." If somebody, a shchivmera, for example, is divvying up his property, Rabbi Elazar Omer, echad bari v'echad mesukun, whether you are a shchivmera or whether you are not a shchivmera, meaning in general, anybody who wants to divvy up his real estate, okay, has to go through some kind of formal process. What we've been learning that all you got to do is speak, that's not true in the world of Rabbi Elazar, right? He says if it's nechasim sheish lahen archayev, if it's real estate that he's giving over, even though he's got 1 day to live, nevertheless, niktin bekesu b'shtar b'chazaka, you have to go through the conventional form of property conveyance, which is kesef shtar and chazaka. V'she'en lahen archayev, if it's movable property, not real estate, and niktin el b'meshicha, you need to do a full-fledged meshicha, just like anybody else would. So there is no special consideration in the world of the shchivmera. Okay, that is all the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, as explained by the Rashbam on the bottom. That basically he disagrees with this concept of divrei shchivmera kiksuvin u'kumesurin dami. Okay, fine. So he's like a regular person. Doesn't matter if you're sick. It doesn't matter if you're not sick. That's the end of that. So the Gemara ends off with a story. I'm sorry, the Mishnah. The Mishnah ends off by saying, Amru lo. So they told Rabbi Elazar the following. How could you say what you said? Ma'aseh b'iman shel b'nei Ruchel. There was a story of the mother of the children of a person named Ruchel, right? Ruchel usually sounds like a woman, like a Rachel, like a Ruchel, but this is actually a father. The father's name was Ruchel. So Shahaisa Chola. So the mother was sick, okay, and she had children. The Amra, and she said, Tunu kibina sila bisi, give my necklace to my daughter. Bihibishnema sarmana, and it's worth 12 mana, which is a lot of money. And it doesn't sound like she did a formal kinyan. So she was a shchivmera. She did not go through the kinyan route, okay, like Rabbi Elazar a minute ago said has to be done. And what happened? V'kaimu es devareha. And it sounded like she was successful in giving over this jewelry to her daughter. It worked. So how could you, Rabbi Elazar, right? So the Mishnah is asking a implicit question. So how could you say that you're right in your shita that you don't, that you need to make a kinyan? There's a Ma'aseh Shahaya that says there was no kinyan. So how do you explain that? Mr. Rabbi Elazar, Amar Lehen, Rabbi Elazar replied, B'nei Ruchel tekabrem iman. His answer was, you assume that this was a permissible act. I'm going to give them a klala, a curse, that the children of Ruchel should bury their mother. Okay, so that's how it ended. And the Rashbam explains that the only way, right, you could bring a a raya from this. I'm sorry, you can't bring a raya because they were a shoim. Okay, and it just wasn't done right. I'm sorry, I actually explained it wrong. Their mother should bury them, okay, because they took it. Okay. Anyways, the bottom line is it wasn't a good thing that they did. So let's look at the Gemara. Right? The Mishnah doesn't explain. I mean, you're like wondering, wow, that's quite a curse, right? Just because you did something that, was debatable, whether or not you need a kinyan. So because they did it wrong, they should get a curse that they should be buried by their mother. It seems a bit extreme. So the Gemara obviously is going to dig deep and say something's going on here. That doesn't make sense. So if you go down, we're like kind of in the middle of 156b now. Kufnun Vav on the base. The Gemara tries to explain what happened. My time a kalayit lahu, meaning there has to be more to the story, right? They just didn't like wake up one day and say, okay, we're going to give these guys a curse because they did something against the Chachamim. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Makaime Kotzin Bekerem Hayu. Okay, so now the Gemara says, no. The backstory is that these people did a certain Aveira. Okay, we're going to see exactly what they did, but they did an Aveira. So because they did a certain Aveira, we are going to give them a curse. Okay, what did they do so bad? They let thorns grow in their kerem. Rabbi Elazar l'taimei, and Rabbi Elazar, it should really be the Girsa should be Rabbi Elazar holds that Ditnan, he holds like the Mishnah in Kelayim that says Hamakayim kotzin bekerem, Rabbi Elazar Omar Kidesh v'chacham Omar lo Kidesh. So this Mishnah in Kelayim talks about the following case. We're going to see that there's a concept, a separate concept called Kilei HaKerem, okay, which is that you have various forms of Kelayim. One of the forms of Kelayim, of mixed breeding or interspecies is, or cross-pollinating, whatever you want to call it. One of them has to do specifically with a vineyard. Okay, so if you have a vineyard that gets mixed with other species, then the result is whatever grows after is usher. Everything becomes forbidden. Everything. The question is, what's in the category of everything? Meaning, if something grows that an ordinary person would throw out, okay, is that considered usher or not? So what's the example over here? The example over here was that Bnei Ruchel had a kerem, and they had thorns growing in that kerem, okay, that was, quote unquote, infected, because thorns are something, okay, thorns are something that, as the Rashbam explains, are edible by animals, okay, but they're not edible by people. So what do we consider, right? What do we consider something else grown with kilayim? Okay? I'm sorry, what do we consider something else grown with a kerem? So do thorns constitute another species or not? That is the question at hand. So Rabbi Elazar says kidesh, meaning he's quoting the pasuk that we're going to see in a minute, that says that yes, everything becomes forbidden. And the Chachamim say, lo kidesh, ela davar shekamohu mekaymin. The Chachamim say, no, that is not a forbidden thing, because that's something that is not what we would call mekuyim. It's not something that is standard, that is going to be used by people. So it seems to be that they're arguing about whether thorns are something that have a use. So if they have a use, then they're considered a species. If they don't have a use, then they're not considered a species and can be mixed bred with a kerem. So, and the Gemara goes on to say, Bishlam Karkom Chazi. And the Chachamim are explaining that I understand if something grew like karkom. Karkom in English, technically, I think is a spice called saffron. It's like a seed that smells nice, right? So if that is a result of Kelayim, then that I understand. That has a good use. You could use it for besamim, you could use it for spices in your soup, you could use it, you could sell it. Ela kotzim, l'may chazi. Kotzim go in the garbage. So you can't tell me that kotzim are a significant species if you have to pay to get rid of it, right? It has no, right? It's not an asset, it's a liability in the view of the Chachamim. So that's a good point. So if that's true, then what's the counter argument to that? What's the reason of Rabbi Elazar, who says that Kelayim who says that thorns is a problem if you maintain it in a sadeh of a kerem, of an orchard with grapes? What's the problem? So I'm Rab Chanina, my time with Rabbi Elazar. What's the Rabbi Elazar's reason? Sheken ba'aravia mekaymin kotzin b'sados ligmalehen. Because, says Rabbi Elazar, there is a place on earth, we'll call it Arabia, wherever that is. Over there, they actually do keep their thorns, right? Like us, our garbage, right? We don't throw it out, we compost it, we make use, we recycle. So this is recycling 2,000 years ago. They would take the garbage and they would actually use it for animal food, but a specific kind of food only for Arabian camels. Okay, I actually looked this up. I did some fact checking. I'm not going to bore you with Arabian camels, but it's a well-known fact that there are some species like the giraffe and the camels that actually do eat cacti. I've seen videos. I mean, I had to prepare. Obviously, I don't just say things that aren't true, but I did see videos of camels eating cactus leaves that had really, really long, needles. And the way they explain it is that their tongues are very thick, and like to us, it's unimaginable to eat thorns, but to them, they actually eat the thorns. So if you do, fact check this Gemara, you'd be pleasantly surprised. Like I've been saying for 3 years, that everything in here is true. We may not understand it, but everything in here, in fact, is true. Anyways, not that I have to prove the Gemara right, but just in case you were wondering if this fact is true. So Rabbi Elazar says, thorns equals food, therefore we're good. Meaning we're good, we're bad, because this is a real species, and therefore, if I maintain kotzim in this kerem, that's it. Then there is a problem. It's all aser bahana, and if it's all aser bahana, that goes back to why he says in the Mishnah why they were cursed. They were cursed because they were doing a sin. Now, you would think that the next discussion would be, I understand they did this sin, but that doesn't really answer the question as to why they were, this is like a real curse, that their mother should bury them. That seems a little overboard. So it does answer the fact that they committed some kind of sin, but the question is, did they really deserve this curse? I didn't really see any commentators that discuss, this is not one of the Yaharag Val Yavors last I checked, Kelayim. So I'm not sure why it ranks, up there with getting such a wild curse, but leave that as it may. That's the Gemara. Okay, so what I wanted to focus on, in case you couldn't tell by now, is I wanted to take a turn and discuss Kelayim. Like I said, it's very heavy stuff over here, all this discussion about Shchiv Mera and wills, so I wanted to talk, more about Kelayim. We had mentioned it, I think the last time we spoke about Kelayim was the Gemara at the end of the 5th parak of Bava Kama, when we discussed cross-breeding animals. Remember where it talked about if you're manhig a shor and a chamor, right? In the Gemara at the end of the fifth parak, I think on Nun Hay or so talks about if I um, if I have a fish. Remember that Gemara at the end of Shoshana Hazapara, if I have a fish on one end and if I have a donkey on the other end, right? Am I over Los Achrosh, working with two different animals? So we touched a little bit about Kelayim, but I wanted to talk about this concept of Kelayim, and then I wanted to go back actually to this story and bring other Gemaras that have a very similar discussion about, okay, is it normal if in one place of the world they do things a certain way? Because that should raise our antenna as to why do I care about Saudi Arabia, what they do there? How does that affect me in New York? Okay, so that is a really, really big discussion. So let's just look. Let's just look at this pasuk, because this pasuk, it seems like every week we quote psukim from Parshas Kitetse, right? We already mentioned that it has the most mitzvos. It has 74 mitzvos. So you have a one in, I don't know, 12 chance or so that your mitzvah is going to fall into Kitetse. So if you look at the actual pasuk says, let me open it up. Lo tizra karmacha kilayim pentikdash hamleya hazera asher tizra utfuat hakarim. So we know that there's actually 5 types of kilayim. Okay, 1 is clothing related, 2 are animal related, and 2 are field related. So let's talk about the field related ones. 1 happens to be mixing any 2 vegetables, anything that's grown. I can't mix vegetables with cucumbers. I can't mix onions with corn. Okay, I can't. That is one Isser that we'll see appears in Parshas Kedoshim. In Parshas Kitetse, we focus on a very, very specific product, which is the product of grapes. Okay, we know that grapes in general in the Chumash get a lot of press. Okay, a lot of negative press, right? If you remember in Hazinu, it talks about Yayin Nesach, right? Bad things happen with wine. And here's another, so to speak, remez about bad things happening with wine. Okay, we're going to see actually one of the commentators brings that up. But what does the pasuk mean? It's a pasuk that we all read. But if you see, it says, Lo tizra karmacha kilayim. The pasuk says that you can't sow your vineyard with kilayim. It doesn't say don't have a vineyard mixed with other species. It says in your kilayim, you can't sow your vineyard. I'm sorry, in your vineyard, in your kerem, you can't sow kilayim. Okay, keep that in mind. Why not? Pen tikdash, because pen tikdash hamalea hazera asher tizra, lest the seed that you have sown will sprout and it would be tikdash. So usually we assume the word tikdash means holy, right? We've seen the word kodesh, but we're going to see a source that says here, this is not holy. In fact, it's the opposite, utfuat hakarim. And whatever comes out, the tfuah, the karim, everything that is a product of this vineyard that's unholy now or that's holy is forbidden. So we could all agree that this is a very confusing pasuk. So the first thing I like to do is I like to look in the Targum. Okay, Onkelos or Yonatan ben Uziel. So the word that I don't understand is what is pentikdash, right? Usually pentikdash is holy. So the way Onkelos translates it, he says, Lo tizra karmacha eruvin dilma tistaev. The word tistaev in Aramaic actually is a Hebrew word. It comes from the word dirty, like yadayin misubaot, right? About having dirty hands that you have to wash. Right? Musuba means dirty. So here it means, what does dirty mean? It means not pure. So we're taking the word tikdash and we're saying it means actually the opposite. It doesn't mean holy, it means dirty, which I'm not going to say dirty is an antonym of holy, but it means, very, very similar to that. And if you think about what the beauty, I'd like to say, of the Hebrew language is that sometimes you have one word and it means the complete opposite. Okay, here is a perfect example for all you Hebrew linguists, right? I'm going to read from the Ksava HaKabbalah, okay, another favor of Mecklenburg. He says, Ki hakadosh yamar al hahevdel, something that is, as we say, lahavdil, right? The opposite. Ulazeh yomar gamken al hatuma, kumo al tiga bo kiki dashticha. B'yonatan ben Uziel pen tikdash titchayev yakita, v'hu, right, it means it has to be burned. V'hu kamamad hatalmud, so he quotes the Gemara that tukad means tukad h, it has to be burned. The ikahorat shoresh kadosh letaer tchunata varshehu muvdal umufurash mizulato. The word kodesh, and we should all be thinking to ourselves, oh, this sounds like Parshas Kedoshim, right? The famous Rashi and the famous Ramban that begin to it. Here he is, he's talking about, what does the word kodesh mean? If I say something is holy, what does it mean? Like you ask a kid, what is holy? The word holy means something shehu muvdal umufura, something that's separated. Imitzad ma'aloto lihiyoto niskav umrama mikol. When I say something is separated, it could either be positive or it could be negative, right? It's like, you know, like the word different, like someone running on a platform. We need change in America, right? So the assumption is, if I'm running for president and I say we need change, that change is always good. Well, not all the time. Change could also be bad. So this is exactly the point over here. If something is muvdal and mufrash, it could either be, as he says over here, it could be high, it could be great, o mitzad pritato hu nivdal v'nifresh mikol, or it's lower. Amar kedoshin tiyu, klomar perushim umuvdalin miprichuta chomerehem, different. Then he brings another, bikravaya kadesh. He says, if you look throughout the Chumash and at the word kodesh, you'll see that it always means different and separated, sometimes in a good way and sometimes in a bad way. For example, here's a great example. There's lo tiyeh kedesha. You know what a kedesha is? A kedesha is a prostitute. So could you imagine the Torah is using the word kedesha on the one hand to say kedoshim to you, and that same root, kuf dalet shin, means a prostitute, okay, or promiscuous, right? That's what it means, lo tiyeh kedesha, right? I'm not going to talk about that now with that, right? But yeah, it means don't be promiscuous, right? So the same word. So we see that the word kedusha, you could either elevate north, or you could go down south. So off the bat, it's an interesting pasuk because it uses this phrase of pen tikdash, meaning the product of this kerem, of this Kelayim, is now all verboten. Okay? So we understand a little bit about it. Now let's confuse matters by explaining in the eyes of the chinuch, as of course we're going to bring, because he's our go-to guy, and explaining the mitzvah. And right off the bat, when you look at the mitzvah of Kelayim 548, okay, he says the koteret is shelo lizroa Kelayim bakerem. Now, I'll go out on a limb. This is like the third week in a row I'm going out on a limb to say that nobody ever thought that the Isser of Kelayim, okay, for a vineyard is specifically to plant two separate grains into the vineyard. All right. It's a very, very obscure law that I would like to guarantee that we didn't hear of, because it's a very confusing pasuk, and we don't really learn Kelayim, and we only have to learn Kelayim when it appears in Daf Yomi. But because it's in Zrayim and it doesn't have Gemara, and it's probably the most complicated. If you ever look in the Mishnayos and Kelayim, there's a lot of trigonometry, there's a lot of math in I think in the sixth or seventh parak where the Mishnah talks about squares and hypotenuses and all kinds of interesting math things. It's not a real, learned subject. But again, the point over here is that, again, I'll repeat it. The problem of kerem specifically, as opposed to any other type of kilayim in the world, is that you can't take two species and plant them together in a kerem. Okay, that's number one. So I'm reading from the Chinuch. Shelo lizroa minei hatvua b'kerem. You can't plant any type of tvua in a kerem. Lo kanvus v'luf. Kanvus literally it means hemp. Okay, not the hemp you're thinking of. Beluf, which is also some kind of a grain. V'zeha min hakilayim yikara kilei hakerem, and this is called kilei hakerem. V'al zeh nemar lo tizra karmacha kilayim. V'amru zichronum levracha ma nitzarach v'al kvar nemar schadcha lo tizra kilayim. So the question is, I already learned in Parshas Kedoshim that we can't have a kilayim field. So why do I need another pasuk in Kitetse later on in the Torah to tell you I can't have a kilayim field? Well, we could already guess the answer is Melamed shekol hamakayim kilayim bekerem over b'shnei lavin. So the answer is kilay hakerem is a separate lav. Okay, so now let's define what this means. The kilay hakerem perishes zichronim uvacha, right? The Gemara in Kiddushin we had that says Shehem Shnei Mine Zra'im Shel Tvua. Again, two species of seeds of Tvua, Im Garinei Ha'anavim, together with a grape seed. That's 2 plus 1. Okay? V'zehu Sha'amar Rav Yoshia, if you remember, Rav Oshia is quoted 3 times in Shas to say the following. Okay, Eno Chai Bad Sheyizra Chita Usa'ora V'chartzan B'mapolas Yad. In one fell swoop, you are being zoreya achita usaora and a grape seed. Okay, dahachi mashma lahu karmacha kilayim klomar deve'inan kilayim levad mi karmacha. You need kilayim two things before it even gets to your kerem. So if I put only one species of chita together with a kilayim, that's not a deoraisa kilayim. Okay, keep that in mind. So what's going on over here? The Chinuch says, Misharshe mitzvahs kilayim kasafti al tzad hapshat kimin hagi. Right? The root of the mitzvah of kilayim I wrote, like I always do. Belav deharba b'seder kedoshim tiyu. If you want to look at the essence of kilayim in general, go back to 244, which we're going to see soon. וככנו משם, ועדיין צריכים אנו לדבר פה, מה טעם נתחדש האיסור בכרם דבעינן בו כלאיים מלבד הכרם? So, I get it that if I have 2 by itself, I'm still kilayim, but what does the Torah want from me specifically about a kerem? Why is a vineyard so critical? V'ulai nomar, ki mihiyot kerem davar chashuv ma'od, because kerem is such an important thing, the koach tivo rav, and it commands a heavy demand. So this is a very cute interpretation. He says, if I only had one seed together mixed with a grape, because the grape is so dominant. Since when is a grape dominant? Well, we know grape juice, we know yayin, we know kerem, right? I mean, even we know today. I think the most expensive plant, the most expensive agriculture real estate, you would probably venture to say is vineyards, right? Because they're capable of producing wine, which is, the most expensive, aside from oil, right, is the most expensive, type of, of product that can be produced from the earth. So if I only had one grain, he says that could be batel, and it wouldn't be considered anything. I love this. So therefore, you need 2 others to be equal, if not greater than the kerem. Or else you could taina, right? Or else you put on your Gemara cup and say, well, it's batal, right? Because kerem is so important. If I have something against it, it's all going to be batal. It has to be also two types of tvua, shehem chashuvim be'inyanam, that are chashuv, כמו canvas v'luf, shehem chashuvim be'inyanam. Aval shar minim kulam yisbatlu mimagafanim. And if it was two other items, not tvua, they would also, even though there are two of them, they would still be batel against the mighty powerful gefen. Ve'ena masur midaraisa el rabbanan. And if you did do it, you only be chayiv on a rabbanan level. Okay, so that's, by the way, the essence of the way he explains the Kilei HaKerem. And by the way, the next mitzvah, 549, is actually a separate lav not to eat the produce from this kerem. That's shalol lechol Kilei HaKerem. Okay. It's funny. I'll just read a little bit about it. He says, what's the reason why you can't eat it? So that he goes into the whole discussion about yayin and how bad it is. I thought he was going to bring up, Noach. He doesn't hit on Noach, although I looked into that. I couldn't find any connection between Noach and the kerem and getting drunk. But he does talk about, he says, Shebokama milcholos of Adam, right? Altira yayin ki yisadam. He says ma'orer yetzer leif ha'adam ra u'madiach yetzer tov. He goes into all the bad things about wine. Now it's funny, if you ever want to talk about wine, the Gemara says so many positive things about it, and there's so many negative things about it, right? It's one of those very polar topics that's discussed throughout Shas. But either way, what I want to focus on is when he talks about in 548 regarding the prohibition specifically about kerem, he says, if you want to know my philosophy about Kelayim in general, not kerem, but in general, crossbreeding, look at 244. So this is a famous, I would call it, Sefer HaChinuch, where he explains the whole problem of shatnez, of crossbreeding animals, mixing. Here he goes. Misharshe HaMitzvah, Ki Hashem Baruch Hu bara olamo b'chachma b'tfuna u'b'das. Okay? Enough said. V'asa b'tzir kol atzuros l'fima shahaya tzorech inyano ra'oi lihiyot mechavanos kivun ha'olam. Right? Just imagine you have I.M. Pei, you have Frank Lloyd Wright. You name the architect. You have the most famous, world-renowned architect comes up with a master plan. Okay? La'elaf Havdalas. Right? God comes up with a master plan, right? Zev Masa Bracious. That's called Masa Bracious. And it says, Vayar Elokim es kol asher asa v'hinei tov ma'od, v'rayaso baruch hu hi yidiyaso v'hizbonenaso b'dvarim, ki hu baruch hu legodol ma'aloso, ein tzarach l're'iyas ha'ayin el hadvarim achar ma'isa. Right? God doesn't need our feedback. God knows everything before it happened, after it happened. Aval haTorah tedaber livnei adam b'milos mechuvanot alehen, utchaneh b'shem dvarim kadvarim hamuchanim bahen. She'i efshar ledaber im birya ela b'meh sheyadua elav. Right? You could only talk to and communicate with someone, right? You can't talk to animals about the Monday Night Football game, because you could spend an hour analyzing, right, the Bronco game last night to your dog, but no matter how many hours you analyze it, he'll never understand how they won the game. You could spend the whole day talking about it. You're not gonna make the connection. So too, there's certain things that we, as human beings, just have a finite understanding of, and no matter how much we try to understand or think we understand, it's just not going to happen. Okay? Right? Everything that God did is perfect. bishlemut li'inyano shehu tzarech ba'olam. Every single thing he did is like a puzzle, and it's all necessary for the world. Tziva, and here's the punchline, a controversial punchline nonetheless. Tziva l'kol min umin lihiyot oseh perosav luminehu. The commandment of the apple tree was to produce apples. The commandment of the lemon tree was to produce lemons. Okay, the tomatoes, the vines, the pineapples, the onions, everything that grows is like commanded. And we call it nature, but it was internally commanded that this is what you are going to grow. Kamosha kasuv b'sefer Bereshis. V'lo yisarvu haminim. And therefore they shouldn't be mixed up. Pen yachsar shleimusan, because what's going to happen is their shleimus will be lacking. V'lo yitzaveh alehen birchaso. And God's blessing, right? Vayavarach Elokim. We see that a lot in Parshas Bereshis. The blessing goes to pieces if it's not in its proper order. So therefore, we can't, quote unquote, tamper with nature, with anything. Umizeh hashoresh lefi hanira b'machshavatenu nimna'anu meharbia behemot Kelayim. So, for example, when it comes to animals, when it comes to zera or ilanos and animals mate with each other, it was programmed that when a horse mates with a horse, the baby will be a horse, right? The baby is not going to be an alligator when a horse mates with a horse. Why? So you're going to say, well, of course it has to be a horse because the mother's a horse. Well, we only know that because that's what we're used to. That's what we're programmed into thinking. But if we go to a different planet or a different universe where a horse mates with a horse and they have an alligator as a baby, then we're going to say, okay, that's considered normal. So that's why obviously everything is all relative based on our perception. So this is a very important chinuch, because as we're going to see, he sheds light on this concept of we are not allowed to, I use the word tamper, okay, it's a very dangerous word, but we're not allowed to mess with anything that was programmed ab initio from Ma'aseh Bereshis. Okay, that's the view of the chinuch. And I actually saw there's 4, 5, 6 commentators, okay, that actually construct this exact same theory, okay, as to the reason of Kelayim, which is interesting because when you go to Parshas Kedoshim, let me just read what it says in Parshas Kedoshim, chapter 19, okay, because 244 that we quoted in Sefer HaChinuch is actually taken from the pasuk in Kedoshim that says, "Es chukosai tishmoru, vehem techalot tabia Kelayim, sad chalot tizra Kelayim, ubeged Kelayim shatnez lo ya'alecha." Okay, this is a pasuk we all know in the beginning of Kedoshim, that the introduction is, "These are my chukim." Okay, so what are some chukim? Well, you can't crossbreed animals, you can't crossbreed, seeds in a field, and you can't wear clothing with wool and linen. That is the paradigm of a chok. Okay, and if you actually look in the Rabbeinu Bachya, okay, there's 2 Rabbeinu Bachyas, one in Kitetse, one in Kedoshim. The one in Kedoshim is in Kitetse, is very, very short. What does he say the reason of Kelayim is? I'm going to read it. V'hatam isar Kelayim, sodo, ready for this? Hu irvuv hakochos ha'elyonim lamala. In 4 words, he says something that, right, could give you a headache. What exactly does he mean by that? He says doing something on planet Earth that is unnatural, i.e., crossbreeding animals, somehow causes disturbances in the celestial spheres up there. Again, which is a big chiddush, by actually saying that things that we do down below have a cause and effect of what's going on in Shemayim. Now, we don't understand that. We don't know how. We don't know why. I'm just showing you what the Rabbeinu Bachya says in Parshas Kitetse, and here's what he says in Parshas Kedoshim. Okay, he says Al Das Pshat Tam Isser HaKelayim B'nei Shekol Hadvarim Hanivraim Ba'aretz Ben Chai Ben Someach Yesh Lo Koach U'Mazel Lamala. Okay, we spoke about Mazel, I don't know, 7 or 8 times already. That everything that is created in this world, whether it's living, whether it's attached to the ground, there's some kind of corresponding koach and mazel up there. They call echad ve'echad nivra lamino, and everything is created specifically in its kind. Kiken yusad hamelach yisal b'maisa brachis, because that's what's dictated back at Maisa Brachis. Shia kol echad ve'echad laminehu. Everything is to its kind. Umishahu marbia umarkiv shnei minim harehu mishane umakchish Maisa Brachis. Again, similar to the Sefer HaMitzvahs. I'm sorry, similar to the Chinuch that says that you're somehow makchish, you're weakening, you're tampering, you're damaging what was intended at Maisa Brachis. Shekasuv Sham Laminehu. It says God created Laminehu. V'hu asa hepech Hashem sheratza lahavdil ben haminim ki ilu marias atzmo shehu choshev ki lo yaspiku hanivram shekar HaKadosh Baruch Hu ba'olamo v'hu rotzel lehitchakem. It's almost as if you say, you know what? Look what I created. I created a new product, right? I created now this is not accurate what I'm going to say. I created a tangerine. Okay, tangerine. It's not an orange. It's not a lemon. Or pick a fruit. It's somewhere in between that I devised in a laboratory. And look at this new product. I cloned an animal, and now I have something that looks something like an animal, right? Meaning that what was created wasn't enough. I know better, and I am judge and jury to say that the world needs this new grafted product. You're basically saying that look, God, there's something that you either didn't think about or you just missed completely. And that takes guts, basically in the words of Rabbeinu Bachya. Look at the words. He says, "V'hu rotzel lehitchakem ulahosif od shem minin mechudashin alma shabara chai ha'olamim." God in His infinite wisdom created a whole bunch of things, and you said, you know what? We could use one more. It's like the problem of making a neder, right? You have all these prohibitions, and the Gemara says, you think you're good, right? Who are you, right? There aren't enough, right? There's 365 lotas says. You want to say that now raisin bran is usher to you? It doesn't say raisin bran is usher in the Chumash. You decided to take a neder, so now you have one more lotas set to keep. Like, are you up to that? Like, you're telling me that this isn't enough? So here we are, you're critiquing the architect. Like you're taking, like I said before, Frank Lloyd Wright's plan, and you're saying, I don't like the size of this bedroom. It's a little bit too small. I don't like the size of the bathroom. It's a little bit too big. Yes, Shmuel.
I mean, you could argue that he's doing exactly what he's saying we shouldn't be doing.
I'm just reading.
No, I'm saying he's making up an Isur. The Torah doesn't say all these things are prohibited. The Torah says five specific things are prohibited.
You're right. I'm not saying it's a perfect comparison. I'm just, I'm
and
just saying,
moreover,
you
could say the same thing about the Chinuch's criticism. The Torah's not saying you can't do these things. You can't do anything. It's saying specific things are prohibited.
Right.
And it's like I have a hard time relating to these explanations because that's the way the world has moved forward by creativity.
By ingenuity. Right. Listen, that's why I preface by saying the controversial, because there's many, many commentators that virtually mimic and use the same words over and over. So then you get into the debate of, well, what's considered ingenuity? What's considered good? what's considered bad. And I gave a silly example like a tangerine. But if you think about it, Dolly the lamb, as we're going to see in the Ramban, was a very, very big topic that came up about 20, years ago when it happened, and it's not so pashut.
But
Now you're going to
that,
say,
but
yeah,
that actually wouldn't be usher. It doesn't fit within the rubric. They're creating a new
not
thing.
according to Rabbi Yashav.
I'm just saying, it's the
Okay,
Torah could
so
have said that it's usher. The Torah didn't.
right, right, okay.
He's the one
Anyways,
who's creating new laws.
right, right. But you see where this is very murky, and so let's look at. So we have the Rabbeinu Bachai. It's interesting as Chukotai Tishmoru. Rashi says in his introduction, he says, "Yeah, what I'm going to tell you chukim,
One more
beautiful ibn."
thing, the
Yeah, sure.
OU is now giving they're going to give ashkacha to this lab-grown chicken.
Yeah, lab
They're
grown.
not
Yeah,
saying they're not saying it's Kelayim.
no, I know. Yep, you're right. You are right. You are right. Regarding this, as Chukotai Tishmoru, says the Ebenezer, Lahazer Achar Heyotcha Kodesh, Shalo Taseh Hamas LeBen Adam Kamocha Gam Lo Taseh LeBehema, Lishanot Maise Hashem, Al Ken Katuv Et Chukotai Tishmoru, Kol Min Shalo Yitarev Min Im Min. What the Ibn Ezra says is that the reason why this is prefaced specifically by Kelayim with the word chok is not that we think of like, what's a chok? A chok is paraduma, a kashrus, things that we completely don't understand, throw in Kelayim, right? If you were to ask the average person, he'll say eating pig, Kelayim, and paraduma. That's my top three choks, right? That's like survey says. Okay, that's fine. That's the way Rashi explains it. But the way that Ibn Ezer explains the word chok, he says, you have to keep these so that you don't start manipulating nature. Again, lo tasa lebehema lishanot ma'aseh Hashem. You're going to start changing God's handiwork, which that's a chok. Al ken ksiv es chukotai tishmoru. It doesn't literally mean like a chok, like the word chok in Hebrew today means a law. It's not a question of a law. Chok means the way things work in the universe. You're going to start altering, right? By mating certain animals, you're going to change the direction and the intent of what God did by Ma'aseh Bereishis. So that's the way, that's the stress that the Ibn Ezra says. The Seforno says something very similar, but what the Sforno adds, a beautiful Sforno also, he says, the Hisker Chukim Bimleches Hamire. Now, because if you go later on into this Perek 19, it starts with saying these are the Chukim, and then it talks about Kelayim, and then we get a little sidetracked with like obscure laws about Shifra Charufa and other things that we're not going to talk about. But it talks about Meleches Hamire, right? Roet Son, right? Being a shepherd, Uba Vodas Ha'adama, Uba Malbush, right? Those are the Kelayim related. Uba Mishkal is sexual immorality, i.e. Arayos, right? What's the connection between Arayos and Kelayim, right? You're sleeping with someone who is related to you, right? Just like you can't crossbreed a shor and a chamor, you can't breed a man and his sister-in-law. Those are just two things that should never ever happen. So that's an example of an arayot. Ubamachal ubamishte and kashrus basar b'chalav, right? There's some kind of bond, right, that you can't break between basar and chalav. Ubahagados ha'atidot, right, or like a navi sheker shebekol eile haita hanagat chayim az. These things were very prevalent at that time. That's all they did. They worked. So to them, working the land and clothing and food, those were like big things for them. So that's why all the common denominator between a lot of things mentioned in Perek Yotet in Kedoshim are items that cannot be together. In fact, the word Kelayim comes from, okay, we're not going to talk about where the word Kelayim comes from. We don't have time for that, but that's also interesting. The root of the word Kelayim is like a Beit Kela is like a prison, right? You're separated from everyone. So these also have a root of separation. Anyways, so that's another example of that. And here is the famous Ramban, who basically says it's like a combination. He says, "V'tam b'kilayim." I'm reading from the Ramban in Kedoshim. Ki Hashem bara haminim ba'olam b'kol balei hanefashot batzmachim u'balei nefesh hatenua. Right? Everyone has its own separate life. The tzmachim have their life, people have their life, animals have their life. V'natan behem koach hatolada, the power of reproduction. When things want to reproduce, they reproduce, but they could only reproduce under certain guidelines. You can't change them, you can't intermate them. Right? Just like you need a male and a female to create, right? This is, of course, the whole debate about today, about a third gender, and girls want to be boys want to be girls, right? It's just not going to work reproductive wise, right? Again, he's taking a line from the Chinuch. Right? He's very similar here to the Rabbeinu Bachya. He says, as though a guy is saying, hey, God, I think you may have forgotten to create this species. Right? Like chutzpah, right? Right? Now, you may be trying to get a Nobel Prize. That's fine, in science, but you're also taking a jab at the creator and saying, I think you forgot one. Brios. Okay. Okay, we're not, that's too controversial about, okay, we're going to stop there regarding the Ramban. Sometimes you have to know when to stop. That's part of this. Anyways, so getting back to, by the way, this Ramban is the source of the whole controversy where they asked Rabbi Yoshev about cloning and creating new or different species of animals. I believe he cited this Ramban out of all the commentators. Okay, we only have 6 minutes left. It's a shame. I wanted to get to the rest of the story. If you remember how we got here, which I don't, but I'll try to remember. Oh, the story, right? So. What ended up happening? What ended up happening in the story was that Rabbi Elazar says, yeah, animals here may not eat it, but they eat it in Saudi Arabia. So the question that we should be asking ourselves is, why do we care what happens in Saudi Arabia? How does that affect me in New York? Are you going to tell me that if I have thorns in my vineyard in Brooklyn, which can't happen, but let's say assuming it could, right? So because 7,000 miles away in Saudi Arabia, you could find camels that eat thorns. So therefore, in New York, it affects me. It affects the halacha. So there's actually two Gemaras. I'll run through them quick. One is in Shabbos 144. Okay. And the Gemara in 144 talks about the law of squeezing juice on Shabbos, which is a very complicated topic. But there's a statement made that certain juices are okay, certain juices are not okay. It depends if they're squeezed during the week. Rimonim, the juice POM, P-O-M, pomegranate juice, is actually talked about on page 144b in Masechah Shabbos, if you're allowed to squeeze it. The Gemara said, V'shel beis Menashe bar Menachem hayusochten b'rimonim. Some are permitted on Shabbos because it wasn't natural, it wasn't usually done, but some weren't permitted on Shabbos because it was done during the week. So that's the rule. If it was done during the week, then you couldn't do it on Shabbos. So the Gemara says, Okay, why do I care what Menashe Bar Menachem did in his personal house? Okay, so the Gemara says over here, Amar of Nachman Halacha Kishel Beit Menashe Bar Menachem. We hold like Menashe Bar Menachem that says pomegranates cannot be squeezed on Shabbos for pomegranate juice. So Amar Le Rav or Rav Nachman Menashe ben Menachem Tanahu. Who's Menashe ben Menachem? He's not a Tana. So why do we care? So what are you going to tell me? That we hold like a Tana who would hold like that, right? But who cares? The Gemara says, Menashe ben Menachem have a Ruba de Alma? Wait a second, you're going to tell me that we're going to paskin for planet Earth that you're not allowed to squeeze pomegranates on Shabbos because one person by the name of Menashe ben Menachem in his house liked pomegranate juice? That's preposterous. So the Gemara says, yeah, and brings up our Gemara about the camels that says what you do in Israel may be affected because in Saudi Arabia, 1,000 miles away, the camels there like to eat thorns. So because one place in the world has camels that eat thorns, and therefore they're considered a asset to the field, so therefore it's considered kilei hakerem, even though it doesn't affect you in Israel. So therefore, it can happen. So Gemara says, how are you comparing me to Iria, the Arabia Asra? You could tell me that what matters in Saudi Arabia is important because that's a big land and you have millions of camels. So therefore, I could say it applies to everywhere in the world. Hacha, when it comes to Menashe's house, but Ladaita Etzel Kol Adam, he's outvoted 5 million to 1 because he's one person. So the Gemara gives a different answer why the pomegranate juice is a problem. So that's one Gemara that talks about a similar concept. And the last Gemara is another Gemara, a famous Gemara in Shabbos 92. Okay, I'll just end off with this, just to show you that this concept is talked about a lot. There's a Tosfos in Shabbos that talks about this. There's a Ritva in Shabbos that talks about this. This is talking about carrying on Shabbos. Okay, remember in Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? The scene where Marianne is hiding in one of those baskets and it's on top of someone's head, right? So people back then used to carry things on their head, right? They still do today in some parts of the world. So the question is, what about Hilchas Shabbos? Meaning you have to carry something with your hands, with your arms, says the Gemara, right? So how do you view something that's done in certain parts of the world? So the Gemara says, Amarav, Hamotzi Masoy b'Shabbos al Rosho Chayav Chatas. If I carry something in Shabbos by balancing it on my head, you're Chayav. Why is that? Sheken Anshe Hutzol Osin. Because there's a city in Israel called Hutzal, and that's how they do it there. Says the Gemara, Anshe Hutzol Ruba da Alma, what do I care about what goes on in Hutzal, right? What goes on in Hutzal stays in Hutzal. Shmuel, you like that? Anyways, so therefore the Gemara ends off by saying the following. No, this is what the Gemara means. Hamotzi masoyel rosho putter. If you carry something on your head, you're putter. So now we're changing the Gemara around. What do you mean you're putter? Next line on 92b. V'imtim solomar anshe hutzol osin can. And if you're going to tell me why you putter, isn't there a place in the world called Hutzol, right, where they did it? No, but ladaito etzel kol adam. We don't care about the city of Hutzol because in Hutzol, it doesn't really matter. It's a minority of the world. People don't care about Hutzol. Asks Tosfos, and this is how we're going to end. What do you mean we don't care about Hutzol? Didn't we say on 144 like 2 minutes ago, right? He says, Mashmadal As says Tosfos, it sounds like when it comes to a city, we also say Batla Daito, the concept of who cares. But the Gemara said, but Tosfos says, didn't we just get through finished saying when it came to the house of Menashe, right? Only he could say Batla Daita Eitzel Kol Adam by a single person. But when it came to a city, right, we don't say that, right? So that's Tosfos' kasha. So which one is it? So here's the answer. V'yesh lomar Tosfos says the hasam chashuv min hagaravia dilakol ha'olam nami im haya lehem rov gemalim havana makaymi. When it comes to our case of Saudi Arabia and the thorns and the camels over there, that is considered kol ha'olam, because theoretically, if we all lived lo yaleinu in Saudi Arabia and we all had camels, all of our camels would be eating thorns. So if that's true, it would affect everybody. Aval be Menashe, the Chad Gavra, but when it came to Menashe, he was one single solitary person. We don't care if everybody had rimonim, they would possibly squeeze them, but we don't care about that. We care only about Menashe because that's what he did, as opposed to Arabia, which if we were all in Arabia, then we would all be also having our camels eat the thorns. All right. And on that note, that's it for Kelayim.